From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Hostage diplomacy with Iran is back as the Biden administration negotiates a return of 5 Americans held in Iran in return, reportedly, for unfreezing $6 billion in Iranian assets in a South Korean account. We'll talk about the looming hostages for money swap and whether it's the first step toward a larger agreement over Iran's nuclear weapons program. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and here with my colleagues, Kim Strassel and Elliot Kaufman. Kim, you know, is the columnist extraordinaire and editorial writer of the Wall Street Journal, and Elliot Kaufman is our letters editor, but he follows events in the Middle East closely and writes editorials on the news from that part of the world from time to time. Welcome to you both. So late last week, we learned that Iran had moved Americans out of Evin prison, usually called the notorious Evin prison in press accounts, to house arrest. The White House welcomed the move and explained that negotiations are continuing with Iran and would have no more comment. But leaks from the administration say the money will come from that South Korean account, and not leaks, but explanations by John Kirby, the White House security spokesman, says they will not be a violation of sanctions. No sanctions will be eased as part of this deal. Let's listen to Adam Smith, the ranking Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, on the likely deal.
Qatar will control the money. So whatever the mullah in Iran has to say about it, it will be controlled by Qatar, not by Iran. So that aspect of it makes sense. We're still waiting to see what the prisoner swap looks like and to finalize the deal. But there's a lot more detail here that I think isn't being understood.
Yeah, but I mean,
the Trump administration transferred billions of dollars from these other countries back to Iran with no strings attached, and I don't hear anybody talking about that.
That was on Fox News Sunday, and let's listen now to his counterpart on the House Armed Services Committee, Michael McCall.
I have to use the word naivete. Look, these are like accounts in South Korea frozen, assets going to Switzerland, and then to Doha, Qatar, to then go into Iran. The idea that the Ayatollah is not going to have any control over this money. And by the way, we're talking about $6 billion, right? $6 billion. Under Obama, it was $400 million of cash and airplanes that went into Iran. Look, I want to get these Americans home more than anybody. And one of them is a critical asset. I agree with that. But we have to go in eyes wide open. $6 billion that now is going to go into Iran and prop up their proxy war terror operations and their nuclear bomb aspirations.
Well, the Qatar government's going to make sure that all this money is spent on medicine and food. Elliot, what do you think of that?
Well, they say that Qatar will abide by these various restrictions. The Biden administration says that. The Iranians, for their part, have been very clear. They claim there are no restrictions whatsoever. So someone isn't telling the truth here. But even if there are restrictions, the whole thing is a ridiculous pretense, because by freeing up $6 billion that Iran might have spent on food or medicine, it now has $6 billion more to finance all of its terrorism, imperialism overseas, and its nuclear program. It's also worth remembering that we've tried arrangements like this before with sort of humanitarian exemptions, and the Iranians have used them to break the sanctions regime. They got away with $20 billion worth of spending on illicit activities under the cover of a sort of humanitarian food and medicine operation. So we're talking about restrictions that we know they've broken before, and that even if they do abide by them, it doesn't help us so much.
Let's listen to the former Secretary of State under Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, talk about this mooted deal on WABC radio on Sunday.
Everybody wants every American returned home. I worked hard to bring back 50-plus Americans, but you can't pay ransom, because when you pay $1 billion per American that's held hostage, I can assure you the Iranians are in this for the business model. This will make them flush. This will build their economy. And so you now have a situation where we have told the Iranians, for every American you take, the Biden administration will provide you with $1 billion. And I know some are out there saying, but it's only for food and medicine. Someone paid your healthcare costs and paid for all your food. You'd have money left over to spend on whatever you wanted, right? The Iranians have money that's left over, and they'll spend it on their nuclear program and conducting terror and attacking Americans.
Well, Kim, one of the oldest lessons in economics, money is fungible.
That's right.
And the administration knows this. They're smart people. But what really troubles me is, first of all, there's a real dilemma here, right? What do you do to try to get Americans back? It's a difficult situation. Your heart goes out to the families, to the people imprisoned. You want to get them back. But what price do you pay? And when you pay a price, what message do you send? And I think that's one of the issues here, particularly when it comes to the malevolent activities of Iran. This is not an abstraction. They are building missiles and drones to send to Russia to use against Ukraine, which we are sending money to Ukraine to defend, and arms to defend against. It's not too much to say. We're going to end up financing both sides of the conflict.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me about Pompeo's comments was his argument that this is a business model. Because look, one of those 5 Americans that we're trying to get back, Siamak Namazi, was snatched not long after we did that infamous Obama-Iranian nuclear deal with Iran in 2015. And they took this person because they were already planning for this extortion. And so I agree with you. It's a terrible dilemma. What do you do? But when you're dealing with an adversary that is clearly doing this for the purpose of being able to extract money for you, I think it makes it harder, the question of whether or not you reward that, because you're only going to perpetuate it. But then, yes, you look at the fact that where's this money going and what are we going to be enabling by it? You mentioned sending drones to Ukraine, but we're going to be allowing Iran to give more money to Shiite militias in Iraq. Those would be the same ones that targeted and killed Americans, to proxies in Syria, aiding Bashar Assad, proxies in Lebanon, Afghanistan. They're funding people there. And moreover, I would note that this expansionist activist strategy of Iran in recent years to foment upheaval in the region has expanded into new types of works too. We now have cyber attacks that they're engaging in, targeted assassinations. Only recently, the United States dispatched aircraft and personnel to try to deter them from seizing commercial ships in the area. So we are spending billions, as you say, to try to counter this very aggressive strategy that they have. And then why on earth would we ever be sending equal or more amounts of money to allow them to continue it?
Elliot, what do you think the administration is calculating here? Because they're going to get criticism like we heard in those clips and like you're hearing on this show. But they clearly seem to think that this is worth the trade. What's their thinking?
It isn't for the short-term payoff with headlines, because this is the largest hostage ransom payment in U.S. history. That's not going to go over well. What they're planning on is a sort of unwritten deal with Iran, a nuclear deal. And it's the kind of thing that they could never get by Congress, and they know that. And even though there's a law saying that any Iran nuclear deal would have to go by Congress, they're trying to skirt that with some of these one-off measures. And what we're beginning to see, news stories here and there, and we actually wrote about this in June and sort of said a hostage payment might be in the offing as the first step in this, is an unofficial deal whereby the U.S. transfers, releases billions of dollars in sanctions relief to Iran, not in exchange for giving up any of its nuclear material, like previous Iran deals had sort of talked about, but just in exchange for sitting still on the threshold of being a nuclear weapons power, for sitting on that threshold. And so $6 billion now. Some people calculate the U.S. has already released as much as $16 billion overall that was previously frozen. Secretary of State Blinken says this isn't sanctions relief, but releasing $16 billion that had been frozen for terrorism purposes.
Where does that money come from, that $16 billion?
So it comes from different accounts. Before this $6 billion, there was $2.75 billion frozen in Iraqi oil payments. And there have been a series of these different Iraqi payments. U.S. sanctions enforcement has also slowed dramatically with Iran. So there's a question of how much really are we giving up once you add up all of these things, and how much more is still to come?
On the issue of the hostages, Kim, the business model point that Pompeo made. Remember in 2015 when President Obama struck the JCPOA, the initials for the first nuclear deal? That was in April or, first half of the year. The Iranians that same year took one of the hostages who's now on the list to be released. His name is Siamak Namazi. He's a dual national, Iranian and U.S. He was seized and put in prison not long after that 2015 deal. Remember all the talk after that deal? This will help Iranian behavior. This will bring them into the normal family of nations. And instead, they go back and they go, oh, let's go get some more chits for extortion, for ransom payments from the Americans. And it makes me think, let's say the administration goes ahead with this deal, which I think they will. And one of the things the President of the United States ought to stand up and say is, this is it. No more helping out Americans who get put in prison by the Iranians. You visit Iran at your own peril. And, pretty much should say there's a no travel zone to Iran.
Oh, I agree with you entirely. But I think the problem at this point, Paul, is that no one's going to believe him, right? I mean, this is not an administration that you think is going to stand tall after having put that line in the sand, as it were, given the fact that it will have just gone through with this hostage deal, given some of its prior actions. And what I really worry about, Paul, is not just that Iran is already planning to cash in on this malfeasance and bad behavior, which, as you know, they've been building up to for the past 7 years or 8 years, ever since we signed that deal, by snatching people off the street, but that it's going to embolden other countries to begin doing the same as well, too. And we've already obviously seen that. But if you are an adversary in any way of the United States and you want some sort of concession, what's going to be the quickest way to do it, given the behavior of this Biden administration? Go out, target a dual national, target an American who's visiting, trump up some phony charges, put him into prison, and then say the only way you get him back is to unfreeze our assets or give us this concession in these negotiations. It's a very, very bad business model for the United States. It's a tough call, but we should not be encouraging it in any way.